speaking to someone else. Marcela, I want to welcome you. Good morning. Thank you so much for making time. I know you have a very, very busy day and today and tomorrow. We've been
Good
trying to
morning.
address how to. We've been trying. Our first week of this course, as you know, ask this question of what is poetry. Last week I had Bill in and we spoke about why do this crazy thing of spending a few years of your life reading books and talking about literature and the whole practice of literary study. This week with you, becoming more focused on what are the benchmarks or what do we seek to gain in studying specifically poetry. And I of course represented for everyone, as I always say to you, this is the introductory level of a two level education where you cover the more advanced levels, including producing poetry of your own, of students producing poetry of their own. Um, why are we doing this? Why are we studying poetry, and what do we gain by doing this? What should we be gaining? Is it just a study of meter, of rhythm, of these traditional elements, to coming to a sense of free verse? Is it understanding how to attend to that, as you heard the students with their excellent comments just now, of hearing the poetic notes in speech that surrounds us everywhere? What's your view on this? I know you've thought more about it than just about anyone else.
Well, hi. Well, first of all, good morning, everyone. And your discussion is really pretty interesting and smart. So it was very fun to listen to that. Um, yeah. First of all, I mean, you've stated this as a two-part question, and the first question is, what is poetry, which is always an eternal kind of question. Some people say poetry is like pornography. You know it when you see it, but you can't really define it. Um, and it seems to be that there's a lot of stake at this. Financially, poets don't make money and prose writers do. And also, I mean, this kind of break happened in the very beginning with Plato kicking the poets out of the Republic. So I think that anybody or any genre that gets so much negative attention must be really important. It must be really dangerous. And that's why we study it. It's like people saying, no, no, don't do that. It's not worth your while. Oh, okay. What's in it? And I think the earliest feelings about poetry, when Plato kicked the poets out of the Republic saying that they were liars, he also had a feeling that poetic poetic meters and rhythms get you very excited. They get your heart beating. They stir you to action. They make you want to do something. They change the way you think. And this is really dangerous and radical stuff. And I think that this is really the value of poetry. It can move you like nothing else can. Poetry, the second thing that I wanted to say is that it's incredibly embodied. We use the measuring system from the Greeks, which doesn't really sync up because English isn't really like the Greek language, but it's set in the body. You've got feet. The feet were ways of moving to rhythms and to words. And so one way to think about poetry, other critics have called it a non-alibi for being. Poetry is the genre that doesn't let you pretend that you're someone else. It doesn't let you shirk off responsibility. When you speak in poetry as an I, you are yourself, you're responsible. It was interesting listening to you talk about the William Carlos Williams poem about stealing, the plums. You are guilty, you're responsible, you're liable in a poem. And so I think that these are two very, very important reasons that we have poetry and that poetry is still happening today. What is poetry? We all are still defining it. I know that James Loganbach said poetry is whatever it doesn't extend all the way to the end of the page, but it's broken, it's a line break. But then again, Charles Simics, won a Pulitzer Prize for prose poetry. So we're still debating that, but we do know that it's really important. Now, you have this excellent introduction. I'm not really sure if I would make them hierarchies, Professor Feldman, Dr. Feldman here, but I think that what you're learning now is to look at the elements of poetry, the figurative language, the line breaks, voice, the speaker versus the reader, the address. And what I do is just really a continuation of this. So this is a 700 level course in which I teach prosody and genre. And what you'll be doing if you take this course later on is that you'll just be learning how to make music from a line. And I know you're probably doing this right now, but we're also going to be looking at in a more, probably in a more in-depth study, we're going to look at how the line makes our heart beat, how the line moves us. Sometimes I use a choreographer, Miriam Rother, who actually works with the ancient Greek feet, poetic feet. And sometimes we will even dance some of the meters so you can feel what the meters mean. The other thing that is really, really important is the idea of poetic genre. You know, the difference between a sonnet, forms and genres. So the difference, for example, between an epic poem and a pastoral poem, an elegy, and those kind of things. And then we look at forms like sonnets and sestinas, and we look, because those things are sort of shorthand. Instead of saying, yeah, the last 1,000 years about this kind of poetry, we just refer to it in the title. This is a pastoral poem. And this is a shorthand way of condensing tons and tons of history into one sentence so that we can refer to that in the poem. And we know, because poets aren't just speaking into a vacuum. Poets are speaking to other poets across time and space. You know, sometimes it's been said poetry is beyond time and space. It's not really beyond time and space. It's deeply embedded within time and space, but it reaches out to the other time and space points in the world. And so it's really pretty awesome.
Awesome. That's terrific. Thank you. That was very moving, especially here, the embodied elements, the responsibility, and the deep individuality. And Marcela, I want to ask you two things. First of all, I want to say to everyone, and then I'll ask Marcela the question, that what Professor Sulak just described is exactly the span and the organization of our course. We're going to start talking about the musicality, the meter, the rhythm, probably next week.
Mm-hmm.
Then we'll talk about the forms, sestinas and sonnets, some of which was already mentioned. We just took a broad survey of it. We will spend class by class going over those forms, not as many as you would get in the advanced class that Professor Sulak teaches. And we'll have a condensed version of that history, the pastoral, different eras at the end of our course, so that if you choose to go on with the study specifically of poetry, you're going to be studying a lot of things, then you will be prepared for it. You'll all have to take, if you're an undergraduate in a BA student in our program, you'll all be taking Renaissance and Shakespeare, which are required courses as well, which is largely made up of poetry as well. So these skills and these tools will serve you in good stead as you go forward. Marcela, the balance of learning to be a reader of poetry, to analyze poetry versus creating poetry. Can you talk about that? You are both. You are a student, you're a scholar, you are a professor, as well as, of course, an accomplished poet. How, students, and I got a few of these questions just this past weekend. I just want to write. I don't want to necessarily always write I want to write poetry. I don't want to write analytic academic work. How does the academic side and the analytic, the readerly side fit in with becoming someone who is able, because so many of the people here want to be able to express that voice, and they don't want to spend the time reading other people's work.
Well, I think that all of us kind of naturally are poets. Poetry is something that everybody does, and I started when I was like in 3rd or 4th grade, and so obviously I hadn't studied prosody then. We get it when we're children and we have the songs, Bialik has written all of these beautiful poems that we then sing to our kids, or that we grow up hearing. And I think that it's so naturally embedded in us that in a way we our first songs and lullabies are poems. So in a way we're naturally receptive to all of this. But in terms of the study of poetry, I come to this a little biased because this is just what happened to me. When I was in 5th grade, I had a teacher who took my scribbles really pretty seriously, and she introduced me to a real live poet. And I'd never met a real life poet before, and I was very excited about it. And the real life poet read my work, and she took me seriously too. And she said, "You know what? you don't have a narrative frame for this and the meter's off. Here, you need to study. And so in 5th grade, I started learning just on my own how meter works and how you have to pay attention to the person who's reading your work, and you can't just throw them into your head. You have to frame it in time and space. And I think that that makes the difference between the kind of poetry that you just write for your diary, which is very important, but you know, it helps us survive. We all write poems when we're sad or upset or happy or for special occasions, and they may be shared with our family, or they may just be something that we read and come back to. But if you want to write poetry and share it with the larger world, then you have to find ways in which you involve the reader and you allow them to feel with you, so they're not just watching you emote on the page. And so I think that the study of poetry is what allows this. We might read a poem and say, oh my gosh, that was so moving. Why was it moving? And then when we analyze it, we can see how it works. And I like to kind of think of the beginning creative writing classes sort of like mechanics. You take apart the engine of a poem to see how it works, so that you can put it back together and do it yourself. This is what my dad did with me when I learned how to drive. He made me take apart the car and put, this was before we had like everything was computerized. And so it's, and so I really like this feeling of doing that, because we all are inclined to express and we're all naturally poets. But if you want to hone your skill and hone the craft so that you can make other people feel what you feel, you need to learn these things. You need to see how it works. It's like if you're a jazz musician, you don't just take up a saxophone and start blowing, right? You learn scales. And so this is what we're doing. We're learning scales. We're learning just like you do with painting, just like you do with music. This is what we do with poetry. I'll say one more thing. When I came here from America, from American University in Washington, D.C., and I used to teach, I used to be I used to do the translation program there. Every single creative writer, whether they did fiction, nonfiction, or poetry, was required to take a translation course in poetry. And the reason, and there was always a lot of resistance in the beginning, but then people would say, this is the single most helpful class we've had as creative writers. Why? Because it teaches you to close read in a way that nothing else does. When you sit down and you look at how the words are playing together on the page, you can think of the pages like a playing field, and you have a game going on, and you see how they interact with one another and how they fake each other out and how they score together. So you need to sort of see how they play. And you can only do that really if you come to someone else's work and you read it very carefully and you learn how to take it apart and put it back together. This will also help you later when you need to edit your own work, or when you need to work with friends. I find it hard to edit my own work. So usually I'll work with 2 or 3 other friends and we'll exchange work and read each other's work. Because sometimes I think the biggest problem poets have is that everything exists in their head, but they don't remember if they put it on the page or not. So this jump between the head and the page is something you really learn how to do when you read. The second thing I wanted to mention about learning and studying writing is that it's a way of connecting very deeply and intimately and passionately with other poets who have lived in different times and across the world. And so poetry is a conversation, it's a world conversation. So I fell in love with the poetry of Anna Akhmatova when I was younger too. And, you know, for years, I've been writing to her in my head when I write a poem. And then later, Wallace Stevens, and I liked William Carlos Williams, who we're reading now for the same reasons. William Carlos Williams, I think, is really a master of making the words leap and play on the page, the line breaks. They're very provocative and they're very sassy. And sometimes so it's fun when I read and I study and I write. I'm corresponding with them across the years. So I think that's
Wonderful.
really
Wonderful.
the
Thank
reason
you.
we read.
And
Yeah.
and what you say about translation distinguishes and empowers our students, all of us, since we live in a multilingual, in a polyglot context of several languages, and you guys can practice that. You can try to take one of the poems that I've assigned and try to translate into one or two of your other languages, and you'll see a little bit of how it is put together. It is a wonderful way of working. If you have 2 more minutes, I just want to give students a chance to ask. I see there is Maria joins you. She's in Russia. Maria joins you in Akhmatova appreciation. Tamar asked, what do you mean when you say you pay attention to the reader? Is it like a composer keeping in mind what type of musician is playing her compositions? And then maybe there's time for one more question if anybody has, and then we'll let you go, Marcel.
I'm not quite sure. When I said pay attention to the reader, I haven't thought about this in terms of composing and what kind of musician or director will be doing the music. But in terms of the reader, if it also, I'm thinking about lyric poetry here as opposed to narrative poetry. But if suddenly we enter a poem and it's full of symbolic language and emotion, the reader is entering as a stranger. The reader is coming upon a poem like a stranger, sitting on a park bench or on a street, and you don't know how to interpret it. You don't know what to make of it, of what's going on. And so a lot of times you'll spend, all of your energy on the poem just figuring out what's happening. So imagine the poem as a stranger on a bench. You're going to spend all your time thinking, should I approach the stranger? Should I not? Is the stranger dangerous? Is it not? Are they drunk? Are they sleeping? What are they doing? Instead of sitting down next to the stranger and having a conversation. So this is what I mean by keeping the speaker in mind. If you're going to start a poem, you need to have a doorway, or a hand held out, some way for the poet and the reader to connect. So you need to have an entryway for the reader. That's what I meant by keeping the reader in mind. And I saw on Akhmatova's house I went to St. Petersburg for the first time this past January, and that was the most moving thing, just to see where all that poetry was being created, Maria. So good.
Wonderful.
Any other questions?
There's nothing else in the chat. Anybody else have another question? You can just unmute yourself. I don't see everyone. Okay. Well, Marcela, I know Professor Sulak is on her way to Czechia and chasing down from one wave to the next peak. So I wish you a healthy and successful semester there, and look forward to speaking to you from your next stop. Thank you so much for doing this, Marcela. This was really wonderful. Let's give Professor Sulak a round of applause.
It was so good to meet you.
Okay, and I hope some of them get to
study.
Next semester, some of them have the privilege of studying with you down the line.
All right.
Take care.
Bye.
Okay, so everyone else, we're going to stick around for a few more minutes, and I want to go back to William Carlos Williams, since so much of what Professor Sulak was talking about applies there, and I will post a short video with the other two works. Some of what was brought up there, the kind of magic, the kind of having your feelings